I read casualty figures that no longer matched the doctrine I was taught to trust. My reports said one thing, while my superiors needed another. Each night attack failed, and the system asked me to adjust the language, not the meaning. I kept writing, knowing accuracy itself had become the risk. In the early months of 1942, the Imperial Japanese Army and Navy were operating at the far edge of a rapidly expanded perimeter. The opening campaigns of the Pacific War had brought swift territorial gains. Japanese forces had advanced through Southeast Asia and into the Western Pacific with speed that reinforced long-held confidence in their training doctrine. The United States, newly at war, was still assembling forces and adapting to large-scale combat in unfamiliar terrain. Within Japanese headquarters, assessments of American ground troops were shaped by pre-war intelligence reports, limited encounters, and assumptions formed during decades of planning. By mid-1942, attention began to shift south toward the Solomon Islands. Guadalcanal, a long and rugged island covered in dense jungle and cut by rivers and ridges, lay along sea lanes connecting the United States and Australia. Japanese naval planners viewed it as a forward outpost for extending air power and disrupting Allied movement. Construction units began work on an airfield near Lunga Point in the spring. At that stage, the island was lightly defended. Its garrison consisted largely of labor troops and a small number of naval guards. In Rabaul, the major Japanese base in the region, staff officers monitored the progress of construction and the broader operational situation. Among them was Major Takashi Kuroda, an infantry officer assigned to operational analysis. Kuroda was not a senior commander. His duties were routine and technical. He reviewed reports from forward areas, summarized training evaluations, and prepared brief assessments for superiors. His work rarely involved decision-making authority. It focused instead on compiling observations into standardized formats that aligned with existing doctrine. Kuroda had attended the Army War College in the late 1930s. There, he had been trained in the prevailing principles of Japanese infantry combat. Emphasis was placed on night attacks, infiltration, endurance, and the moral superiority of the attacking soldier. Instruction highlighted the perceived weaknesses of Western armies, reliance on firepower, rigid command structures, and a presumed lack of adaptability in close terrain. American forces, in particular, were portrayed as technically competent but physically and mentally unprepared for sustained jungle warfare. These assumptions were reinforced by pre-war intelligence exchanges and by observations of U.S. Marine training exercises reported through diplomatic and military channels. Japanese attachés in the United States had attended demonstrations and reviewed manuals. Their summaries, circulated within the Army and Navy, often described Marine training as methodical but predictable. Live fire exercises, structured landing drills, and standardized unit tactics were seen as signs of inflexibility. Some senior officers reportedly dismissed Marine amphibious training as overly cautious and dependent on naval support. Within this framework, Kuroda's early work involved organizing translated excerpts of American field manuals and training reports. He noted repeated emphasis on small unit coordination, marksmanship, and physical conditioning. These elements were familiar to Japanese planners, but they were interpreted through a lens that prioritized offensive spirit over technical repetition. The conclusion, already widely accepted, was that American Marines would struggle once removed from controlled training environments and placed in hostile terrain. In July 1942, intelligence summaries reached Rabaul indicating increased American naval movement in the South Pacific. Reconnaissance flights observed carrier task forces operating east of the Solomons. Signals intelligence suggested heightened activity but did not clarify intent. Japanese planners believed that any American offensive would be limited in scale. Guadalcanal, though important, was not considered likely to be targeted immediately. Kuroda's daily routine continued unchanged. He compiled logistical updates, reviewed after-action reports from earlier island engagements, and prepared briefings on anticipated enemy capabilities. In these documents, Marine training was often referenced indirectly, through standard phrases describing American doctrine as firepower-centric and defensive-minded. There was no sense of urgency or concern attached to these assessments. On 7 August 1942, the operational situation shifted abruptly. American forces landed on Guadalcanal, Tulagi, and nearby islands. The initial landings achieved surprise. Japanese defenders were overwhelmed, and the airfield at Lunga Point was captured within 2 days. News of the landings reached Rabaul quickly, but the scale and coordination of the operation were not immediately understood. Kuroda received preliminary reports describing American infantry moving inland with speed, securing perimeter defenses, and organizing supply points. These details were routine in nature, yet they differed from expectations in subtle ways. The reports noted disciplined movement through jungle terrain, effective use of patrols, and rapid establishment of defensive positions. None of these observations were dramatic on their own. They were presented as factual notes within longer summaries. Senior officers initially interpreted the landings as a temporary incursion. Plans were made to retake the airfield through a series of counterattacks. Reinforcements were assembled, and naval forces prepared to contest control of surrounding waters. The assumption remained that American Marines, once confronted with determined infantry assaults, would withdraw or collapse. Kuroda was tasked with collating early contact reports from Japanese units probing the American perimeter. These reports described brief engagements, often at night, where Japanese patrols encountered prepared defensive positions. The language was restrained but specific. American units were reported to maintain formation under fire, to respond quickly to flanking attempts, and to employ coordinated small arms fire. In one report, a company commander noted that Marine sentries detected movement earlier than expected, and counterfire was accurate even in low visibility. The report did not attribute this to exceptional skill, but it did note consistency. Similar phrasing appeared in multiple submissions. Kuroda flagged these repetitions as noteworthy, though he did not draw conclusions beyond standard analytical remarks. At this stage, there was no formal reassessment of American training. The prevailing view held that initial encounters could be misleading. Japanese doctrine emphasized that the true test of an enemy force came after prolonged exposure to fatigue, supply disruption, and sustained pressure. Guadalcanal's environment was expected to favor Japanese infantry over time. Kuroda's role remained observational. He prepared a consolidated memorandum summarizing early contacts, highlighting both expected and unexpected elements. The memorandum adhered strictly to approved terminology. It did not challenge doctrine. It simply recorded that American units appeared organized and responsive in terrain previously assumed to be unfamiliar to them. As August progressed, Japanese forces began landing reinforcements on the island. The operational problem became clearer. The American Marines were not withdrawing. They were improving their positions. The airfield, now named Henderson Field by the Americans, began operating aircraft that contested Japanese air and naval movement during daylight hours. From his desk in Rabaul, Kuroda reviewed daily situation maps marked with incremental changes. Japanese advances were limited, defensive lines held. Supply difficulties affected both sides, but the anticipated rapid deterioration of Marine effectiveness did not appear in the reports. Instead, the language remained consistent. Organized resistance, controlled fire, and disciplined withdrawal when necessary. There was no dramatic moment of realization. No single report contradicted established beliefs outright. However, the accumulation of routine observations began to reveal a gap between expectation and reality. Marine training, previously dismissed as rigid and overstructured, was producing units capable of adapting to jungle combat conditions earlier than anticipated. By late August, Kuroda noted that his summaries were being read more closely by superiors. Marginal annotations appeared on returned drafts. Requests for clarification followed. The operational problem was no longer abstract. It was developing in real time, under conditions that challenged assumptions formed years earlier. The work continued, methodical and understated. There was still confidence within headquarters that Japanese forces would prevail. Yet the early signs of limitation were present in the documents passing through Kuroda's hands. They did not suggest failure, but they did indicate that previous evaluations of Marine training might have been incomplete. As the situation on Guadalcanal stabilized into a contested struggle rather than a swift counterattack, the routine assessments that once seemed sufficient began to feel inadequate. The gap between doctrine and observation, though still narrow, was becoming harder to ignore. By early September 1942, The fighting on Guadalcanal had settled into a pattern that neither side had anticipated during the opening days of the campaign. The Japanese expectation of a swift counteroffensive had not been met. Instead, repeated attempts to dislodge the American Marines from their positions met limited success and rising losses. Control of the surrounding seas shifted daily, but on land the front lines changed only incrementally. In Rabaul, operational assessments grew longer and more detailed. Reports from the island arrived with increasing frequency, often contradicting earlier projections. Major Takashi Kuroda's workload expanded accordingly. His task was no longer limited to summarizing routine engagements. He was now required to track patterns over time, casualty figures, ammunition expenditure, and the effectiveness of repeated assaults against the American perimeter. Japanese infantry units sent to Guadalcanal were among the Army's experienced formations. Many officers and soldiers had seen combat in China and Southeast Asia. Their reports reflected confidence in their ability to overcome an enemy through endurance and aggressive action. Yet, as engagements continued, descriptions of American resistance remained consistent. Marine units did not dissolve under pressure. They adjusted positions, reinforced threatened sectors, and counterattacked selectively. One of the early major engagements occurred along the Tanaru River in late August, when a Japanese infantry force attempted a frontal night assault against Marine defenses. The attack was repulsed with heavy losses. Initial explanations attributed the outcome to poor reconnaissance and underestimation of enemy strength. These factors were familiar and did not, on their own, prompt doctrinal reconsideration. However, subsequent operations followed a similar pattern. Japanese units maneuvered through jungle approaches believed to be concealed, only to encounter prepared fields of fire. American Marines employed coordinated machine gun and rifle fire, supported by mortars positioned to cover likely avenues of approach. The terrain, rather than neutralizing Marine advantages, appeared to amplify them. Kuroda compiled after-action reports that described these encounters in restrained language. Phrases such as "enemy resistance remained organized" and "counterfire was sustained beyond expected duration" appeared repeatedly. While these descriptions avoided overt criticism, their repetition suggested an emerging trend. Japanese doctrine emphasized that Western forces would struggle to maintain cohesion in prolonged close combat. The evidence from Guadalcanal did not support that assumption. As September progressed, Japanese reinforcements arrived under increasingly difficult conditions. Transport ships faced air attack during daylight, forcing many movements to occur at night. Supplies were limited, and units often landed with insufficient heavy equipment. These logistical constraints were acknowledged in reports and used to explain tactical setbacks. Yet even when Japanese units achieved local surprise, the Marines' response was described as rapid and disciplined. Kuroda began maintaining a private comparison table, aligning projected outcomes based on doctrine with reported results from the field. This was not an official document. It was a working aid to help him understand discrepancies. In several cases, the expected breakdown of American defensive coordination did not occur. Instead, Marine units redistributed forces and maintained communication under fire. Senior officers continued to frame the situation as a matter of time. The belief persisted that American Marines, operating at the end of long supply lines, would eventually weaken. The tropical environment, disease, and constant pressure were expected to erode their effectiveness. Japanese commanders emphasized perseverance and the moral dimension of combat, confident that endurance would decide the contest. Yet the reports reaching Rabaul did not indicate a steady decline in Marine performance. While American casualties were acknowledged, there was no indication of collapse. Patrol activity continued. Defensive works expanded. Artillery and air support, though limited, were integrated effectively into ground operations. These observations challenged the notion that Marine training produced rigid behavior unsuited for prolonged combat. Kuroda's summaries began to include more precise language regarding American tactics. He noted the Marines' use of overlapping fields of fire, their reliance on junior leaders to make immediate decisions, and their apparent familiarity with operating in small, semi-independent units. These characteristics, previously interpreted as procedural rigidity during training exercises, now appeared to facilitate adaptability. At the same time, Japanese units faced difficulties executing doctrinally preferred night attacks. Dense terrain, fatigue, and supply shortages complicated coordination. When attacks failed to achieve decisive results, units were often forced to withdraw under fire, suffering losses that were difficult to replace. These outcomes were recorded factually without attribution to doctrinal limitations. The growing volume of conflicting data created tension within staff discussions. Official briefings continued to emphasize confidence in eventual success, but informal conversations among officers reflected unease. Some questioned whether pre-war assessments of American infantry had been overly influenced by assumptions rather than sustained observation. Kuroda remained cautious. His position did not allow for open critique of established doctrine. Instead, he focused on accuracy. When reports described Marines holding ground despite casualties, he included those details. When Japanese units reported difficulty locating American positions due to camouflage and fieldcraft, he recorded that as well. The accumulation of such details gradually altered the tone of his summaries, even if the conclusions remained formally unchanged. By mid-September, the Japanese launched a series of coordinated attacks aimed at breaking the Marine perimeter from multiple directions. These operations were intended to demonstrate the continued validity of offensive doctrine. The results, however, were mixed. While some ground was gained temporarily, American forces regained positions through counterattacks supported by artillery and airstrikes from Henderson Field. Reports from these engagements emphasized the Marines' ability to recover quickly after initial setbacks. This resilience was noted repeatedly. It contrasted with earlier expectations that American units would become disorganized once plans were disrupted. Instead, Marine training appeared to facilitate recovery and reorganization under pressure. Kuroda observed that the language used by frontline commanders was shifting slightly. Terms such as enemy persistence and unexpected coordination appeared more frequently. These were not admissions of inferiority, but they indicated a recognition of an opponent performing beyond anticipated limits. The gap between official doctrine and field reality was widening. Despite these signs, there was no immediate institutional response. The Japanese command structure was not designed for rapid doctrinal revision during active operations. Emphasis remained on execution rather than reassessment. Reinforcements continued to be committed under the assumption that increased pressure would eventually succeed. As September drew to a close, Guadalcanal remained contested. Neither side achieved decisive control. For Kuroda, the situation represented an analytical problem without an approved solution. His role was to document, not to interpret beyond accepted boundaries. Yet the repeated failures to achieve predicted outcomes were becoming impossible to ignore. The tension between expectation and observation had not yet produced open disagreement, but it had created an undercurrent of doubt within the analytical process. Marine training, once dismissed as inadequate for jungle warfare, was proving consistently effective in practice. This realization did not emerge through a single revelation, but through the steady accumulation of routine reports that no longer aligned with pre-war assumptions. By October 1942, the campaign on Guadalcanal had entered a new phase. The initial shock of the American landing had passed, and the expectation of a quick Japanese counterstroke had faded. What remained was a prolonged struggle defined by attrition, limited resources, and repeated attempts to impose doctrine on conditions that resisted it. Japanese forces continued to reinforce the island, often at significant cost. Nighttime transport runs delivered troops but little heavy equipment. Units arrived under strength, fatigued, and with incomplete supplies. Commanders were instructed to press the attack regardless. The strategic imperative remained unchanged. Guadalcanal had to be retaken. In Rabaul, Major Takashi Kuroda's role shifted subtly but noticeably. He was now asked not only to summarize reports, but to compare engagements over time. Senior officers wanted to know why similar operations were producing similar failures. Officially, explanations centered on logistics and naval setbacks. Unofficially, questions about ground combat effectiveness began to surface. The turning point for Kuroda was not a single battle, but a pattern revealed through repetition. He reviewed reports from multiple regiments engaged along the southern and eastern approaches to the marine perimeter. In each case, Japanese units conducted infiltration and night attacks consistent with Doctrine. In each case, Marine units responded with coordinated defense, immediate counterfire, and controlled fallback when necessary. One report described a Japanese battalion achieving partial penetration of Marine lines during a night assault. According to Doctrine, this moment should have produced collapse. Instead, Marine junior officers redirected units, sealed gaps, and restored the line before dawn. The battalion was forced to withdraw under increasing fire. Casualties were described as significant. Kuroda compared this report with others from different sectors and dates. The details varied, but the outcomes did not. American Marines were not relying solely on static defense or overwhelming firepower. They were adjusting tactics at the small unit level, often without direct orders from higher command. This autonomy was something Japanese doctrine acknowledged in theory, but did not emphasize in practice to the same degree. At this stage, Kuroda began to annotate his working documents with marginal notes questioning assumptions embedded in earlier intelligence summaries. He did not alter official conclusions, but he refined descriptions. Where earlier reports might have described Marine actions as reactive, he now used terms such as anticipatory or pre-positioned. These choices were subtle, but they reflected a change in understanding. The operational problem was becoming clearer. Japanese doctrine assumed that American training produced soldiers dependent on centralized control and predictable patterns. Guadalcanal demonstrated otherwise. Marine training appeared to emphasize repetition under stress, preparing units to function even when plans failed. This was not a revelation stated openly. It emerged through observation. The cost of this realization became personal for Kuroda when casualty summaries crossed his desk from a regiment he had studied closely during pre-war analysis. That unit had been assessed as fully capable of overcoming American infantry through aggressive action. Its losses on Guadalcanal were now well above projections. Replacement rates could not keep pace. Kuroda prepared a briefing slide summarizing engagement outcomes without attributing cause. The numbers spoke quietly. Attack after attack failed to achieve decisive results. Marine defensive cohesion did not degrade as expected. Environmental hardship affected both sides, but it did not disproportionately weaken the Americans. During an internal staff discussion, one senior officer remarked that the Marines were fighting like troops who expect to be isolated. The comment was not formal doctrine, but it captured an emerging understanding. Marine training, previously criticized as overly procedural, seemed designed for precisely the conditions present on Guadalcanal. This realization did not lead to immediate change. Orders remained unchanged. Japanese units were instructed to continue offensive operations. However, at the analytical level, a shift had occurred. Kuroda adjusted his internal framework for evaluating reports. He no longer assumed Marine failure as an eventual outcome. Instead, he began assessing what specific conditions were required to break their defensive system. This adjustment carried risk. Japanese military culture did not encourage deviation from established assessments without directive. Kuroda's notes were careful, phrased as questions rather than conclusions. He asked whether repeated exposure to realistic training environments had produced Marine units capable of rapid adaptation. He noted that American training, often observed in controlled settings, might have been misinterpreted when removed from context.
As October continued, Japanese forces launched another major offensive aimed at the marine perimeter south of Henderson Field. The fighting was intense and costly. Once again, Marine units absorbed the attack and held. Reports described disciplined withdrawal under pressure, followed by counterattacks supported by artillery and air power. When these reports reached Rabaul, Kuroda recognized that the gap between doctrine and reality was no longer theoretical. It had operational consequences. Continued reliance on assumptions about marine weakness was producing predictable losses, yet there was no mechanism to translate this realization into immediate doctrinal change. The turning point, therefore, was internal and analytical rather than institutional. Kuroda had adjusted his understanding of the enemy. Marine training was not a liability, it was a foundation for resilience. This realization did not alter orders, but it changed how he read every subsequent report. By the end of October 1942, Guadalcanal remained contested. The Japanese command continued to plan new operations. For Kuroda, the problem was no longer whether marine training mattered, it was how long the system could continue to ignore what the evidence was showing.
By November 1942, the Guadalcanal campaign had reached a stage where the costs of earlier assumptions were no longer abstract. They were measurable, cumulative, and increasingly difficult to reconcile with official explanations. Japanese forces had committed substantial manpower to the island, yet the operational balance on land had not shifted in their favor. Attrition was taking a steady toll, not only on frontline units, but on the coherence of planning itself. In Rabaul, Major Takashi Kuroda found that his reports were now circulating beyond their original audience. Copies were requested by officers outside his immediate chain of command. Questions accompanied them, carefully worded but pointed. How long could American Marines sustain this level of resistance? Why had repeated attacks failed to produce decisive results? Were environmental factors being overemphasized as explanations? The answers offered in formal channels remained cautious. Supply shortages, naval losses, and air superiority were cited as primary causes. These factors were real and significant, yet Kuroda could see that they did not fully account for the pattern on the ground. Even when Japanese units achieved tactical surprise or numerical advantage, Marine formations absorbed the shock and recovered with consistency. The stakes of this disconnect became clearer as Japanese casualties mounted. Replacement units arriving on Guadalcanal were often less experienced, further compounding difficulties. Meanwhile, Marine units rotated leadership at lower levels with minimal disruption. Reports noted continuity in performance despite losses among officers and non-commissioned leaders. This resilience suggested a depth of training that extended beyond individual personalities. Kuroda prepared a comparative assessment, formally structured to avoid doctrinal challenge. He contrasted expected outcomes based on pre-war evaluations with observed results from Guadalcanal. The language was neutral, but the implication was evident. The Marines were operating as a force trained for sustained, decentralized combat. This was not the force described in earlier intelligence summaries. When this assessment reached a senior planning meeting, the response was restrained but firm. One officer cautioned against overinterpretation of a single campaign. Another emphasized that Japanese forces had not yet committed their full strength. The discussion did not reject Kuroda's data, but it placed it within a framework that deferred reconsideration until after victory. This was the moment when institutional resistance became apparent. The system could acknowledge anomalies, but it struggled to revise underlying assumptions while operations were ongoing. Doctrine had been validated through decades of success. To question it in the midst of combat carried implications beyond Guadalcanal. For Kuroda, the risk became personal. His continued emphasis on Marine effectiveness drew quiet scrutiny.
He was advised, indirectly, to align his language more closely with established interpretations. The advice was not punitive, but it was clear. Analytical deviation, even when supported by data, was unwelcome if it complicated command confidence. Despite this pressure, Kuroda did not alter the substance of his work. He refined phrasing, but he continued to record what the reports described. When Marine units coordinated artillery with infantry defense, he noted it. When Japanese assaults failed despite favorable conditions, he recorded that as well. His role, as he understood it, was to preserve accuracy, even if conclusions were deferred. The consequences of earlier actions were now visible across multiple levels. Japanese units on Guadalcanal faced exhaustion and dwindling supplies. Attacks became less frequent and less coordinated. American Marines, though also strained, maintained defensive integrity. Henderson Field continued to operate, reinforcing the ground situation with air support. Within headquarters, planning documents began to reflect a quieter shift. While public confidence remained, contingency language appeared more often. Timelines extended. Objectives were phrased conditionally. These changes did not credit Marine training explicitly, but they acknowledged a harder reality. The stakes peaked not in a single confrontation, but in recognition of limits. The belief that Marine training would fail under jungle conditions had informed early decisions. Those decisions had led to repeated assaults that did not achieve their intended effect. The cost of that misjudgment was now embedded in casualty lists and stalled operations. Kuroda's work did not alter the course of the campaign directly. He was not in a position to redirect strategy. Yet his analyses contributed to a growing, if unspoken, understanding that the enemy was not behaving as expected. Marine training, once a subject of quiet dismissal, had proven resilient under the most demanding conditions. As November progressed, attention began to shift toward damage control rather than decisive victory. Evacuation planning, though not openly discussed, entered preliminary consideration. The system had not admitted error, but it was adapting. For Kuroda, the experience left a lasting impression. The conflict between doctrine and evidence had reached its peak. The question was no longer whether Marine training mattered, it was whether the institution could acknowledge that its earlier judgments had been incomplete.
By December 1942, the Japanese position on Guadalcanal had become untenable. After months of sustained fighting, attrition, and logistical strain, senior commanders concluded that continued efforts to retake the island would not succeed. The decision was made to withdraw remaining forces. The evacuation, conducted under difficult conditions, marked the end of Japan's ground campaign on Guadalcanal. In Rabaul, the operational shift was reflected quietly in paperwork and orders. There was no public reckoning with earlier assumptions. Official records emphasized material factors: naval losses, air inferiority, and supply constraints. These explanations were accurate, but they did not fully address the ground combat reality that had emerged. Major Takashi Kuroda was tasked with assisting in the compilation of final after-action assessments. These documents were not intended for wide circulation. Their purpose was institutional learning, though framed carefully to preserve continuity with doctrine. Kuroda reviewed months of reports, casualty figures, and operational summaries. Patterns that had once appeared as anomalies were now undeniable. Marine training featured only indirectly in these assessments. The language remained cautious. References were made to enemy adaptability and effective small unit leadership. There was no formal acknowledgement that pre-war evaluations had underestimated the Marines. However, the omission itself was telling. The need to explain repeated failures without attributing them to chance required a more nuanced understanding of the opponent. Kuroda contributed a section analyzing defensive resilience under sustained pressure. He avoided naming specific training programs. Instead, he described observable behaviors: rapid reorganization after disruption, consistent performance despite leadership losses, and effective coordination between infantry, artillery, and limited air support. These observations were presented as empirical findings rather than critiques. The institutional response was measured. No immediate doctrinal revisions were issued. The war situation elsewhere demanded attention. Yet within professional circles, Guadalcanal became a reference point. Future intelligence assessments of American ground forces were more cautious. Assumptions about rigidity and fragility were softened, if not fully abandoned. For Kuroda, the experience shaped his later work. He continued to serve in analytical roles, carrying with him the lesson that training could not be judged solely by its appearance in controlled demonstrations. Effectiveness revealed itself under sustained stress, not in isolated observation. The Marines who fought on Guadalcanal did not become legends within Japanese records. They were described plainly as an enemy that held ground under extreme conditions. Their training, once dismissed, was recognized quietly as a factor in that endurance. The campaign ended without dramatic conclusions in the archives. There was no formal admission of misjudgment, only adjusted language and revised expectations. Yet within those subtle changes lay the acknowledgement that assumptions made before combat had not survived contact with reality. Guadalcanal remained a lesson recorded in margins and appendices rather than proclamations. It was there that confidence based on pre-war observation met the limits of its accuracy. And it was there that the effectiveness of Marine training, tested under relentless conditions, became clear to those tasked with observing honestly. If you value careful, evidence-based histories of overlooked decisions and individuals, consider supporting the channel so more stories like this can be told.